Close your eyes for a minute and picture this. A western vista with red rocks and cacti aplenty, the sun hanging high in the bright blue sky. The sounds of shuffling boot spurs clank into the foreground, a 10-gallon hat the only shady respite for miles. There stands a rough and rugged cowboy, sporting crinkled leather chaps and a beard caked in dust. Between his lips hangs a freshly rolled cigarette, flakes of a tobacco leaf clinging to the edges. It's a picture-perfect description of the modern idea of a cowboy, right? Or you might be wondering, what about his shiny silver Colt 45, or cattle-wrangling lasso, or horse or mule or whatever other cowpoke memento you can think of? While these tools of the trade are most commonly associated with cowboys of the frontier, none of them harbor as much historical significance as the quirly smoking from his mouth, or the nicotine coursing through his veins. For Footprints of the Frontier, this is a deeper dive into the legends and lore of cigarettes, cigars, and tobacco in the Old West. As Spanish and British powers explored the Americas throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, one crop rose above the rest: the tobacco plant. Whether it was used as a medicine or means of pleasure, tobacco was all the rage in Europe. So much so, the demand for tobacco grew tenfold, and the people of both the Old and New World wouldn't rest until a new tobacco empire was formed. The American South stood as the holy ground for such plans, as the tobacco plant flourished across the enriched soils off the southern Atlantic coast. It was mass-produced before the turn of the 18th century, to the point it actually carried a surprisingly low market value. It sold for a measly couple pennies per pound in Virginia, with similar price points in various southeastern ports. Despite this, tobacco demanded labor, intensive labor at that. And with the slave trade at the apex of its operations, tobacco farming and cultivation saw its boom coincide with these trends. To expand enslavement was to expand large-scale tobacco production at a fraction of the cost. With this development, the smaller family-owned farms exploded into massive, multi-million-dollar plantations. And when the soil lost its fertility in one swath of the South, tobacco production quickly migrated to new, more fertile land. Of course, what goes up must go down, and before long, the King of Britain decided he was owed more than his fair share of the spoils of the baccy boom. As the 1770s were underway, exporting tobacco cost colonial farmers 300,000 pounds sterling per year. It wasn't sustainable despite the well-oiled machine that was tobacco plantations, and the people finally had their say. Big Tobacco's honeymoon stage was over. After the Boston Tea Party kicked off a bloody revolution and the American independence was declared, the tobacco industry hit a rut in the road. Exports to Europe were paused indefinitely, and other crops took hold in the American Southeast. Abroad, the British turned to the Ottoman Empire, who were in no short supply of tobacco themselves. On American soil, however, the Tobacco War of 1780 and 1781 saw the Redcoats intentionally set ablaze the bountiful tobacco farms that had propped up the colonies for nearly a century. With trade blockades and dwindling exports, the international market turned its other cheek to American tobacco, and it wouldn't be until well after the United States of America were formed that Nicotiana Tobaccum got its groove back. As the 1800s introduced themselves to a new nation, America rediscovered its love and lust for the tobacco plant. Slavery was still a profitable industry and aided tobacco's immediate return to the throne of U.S. agriculture. Its popularity popped enough to the point its supply couldn't meet the demand, and American farmers were forced to take out loans. Loans from the very same British government they just pulverized into revolution to open up even more plantations. As the American empire reached its zenith, cigarettes saw a similar spike in popularity around other parts of the world. The paper-wrapped cigarette, the black sheep in a family that was dominated by cigars and smoking pipes, entered the fray in Victorian societies throughout Europe. It was long seen as a dirty method of tobacco use left for peasants, but eventually became a cultural beacon of upward social status. The posh parts of society wanted to regain control over such habits and fought to refine tobacco culture. In other words, it was finally cool to take a drag from a cigarette. Meanwhile, back across the pond, American farmers were making their own developments in their quest to perfect the perfect crop. Bright leaf tobacco, popularized by its more mild flavors, hit the mainstream. It flourished due to unusual circumstances, soil with a fraction of the nutrients. It turned out the dust and dirt compost created a tobacco plant that wasn't just sweet, but smelled better too. Thus, chewing tobacco sales skyrocketed, and cigarette production in the United States hit a new gear. As these types of innovations entered production, there was no looking back for big tobacco. The American Civil War, however, would soon throw another wrench into the industry's progress. As enslaved populations across the South were either freed or forced to fight in the war, farmers were left with a labor shortage. They were faced with two options: pay actual wages and turn their slaves into actual workers, or turn to the machines. If you know a thing or two about American history, then you probably already know the answer. Production turned towards industrialization, and in 1881, an inventor named James Bonsack constructed what would become the pivot point in the legacy of tobacco: the cigarette rolling machine. Requiring minimal labor and ensuring a cheaper production than pipes or cigars, the rollers spit out cigarettes over 10 times the speed of human hands, and America never looked back. Following the Civil War, as government debts were repaid, cigarette taxes were slashed, cementing tobacco's place in American culture. However, over the Mississippi River and through the Great Plains, into the deserts and mountains of the Western Territories, tobacco was already forming the lifeblood of frontier existence. Cowboy culture carries many defining symbols: hats and handkerchiefs, boots and spurs, longhorns and horses, lassos and six-shooters, beans and bacon, and enough coffee to fill the Grand Canyon. But did you know cigars and cigarettes are just as symbolic of life as a cowpoke? There were no more preferred method to smoking tobacco than lighting up a cigar. Second in popularity only to chewing tobacco, stogies were the lifeblood of frontier living for working adult men. The relaxing rush of nicotine was an obvious motivator, but cigars were much more than just a pleasant feeling. Cigars could be used as a form of currency, either between cowboys and townsfolk or between white men and Native American tribes. They were also integral to the social fabric of Old West kinship. Campfires were common in the twilight hours, and what better way to share stories and enjoy the warmth of the open flame than doing so with a sweet, smoky stogie hanging from the lips. For many, cigars didn't need to be anything fancy. The domestic brands were crude and cheap, coming in at a penny per two. These stogies were usually long and skinny, with the pigtail twisted off at the end to keep the tobacco insides from spilling. When the Civil War dust settled, taxes on wrapped tobacco increased, pushing the domestic cost all the way to a nickel for one. Cowboys with disposable income, or a passion for luxurious tobacco, could opt in for the finer cigars on the market. Cuban cigars are historically considered the best money can buy, and the same sentiment rang true in the Western Territories. These high-end stogies were full-bodied and bold-tasting, built to endure the ruggedness of the frontier. Fancier cigars often ran on an average of $15 for every 1,000 units. There were a few noteworthy brands favored by old Westerners. Bolivar Petit Coronas were an earthy leather-esque cigar that tasted like cocoa. Quintero Brevas were another top choice, mirroring a cowboy's inclination for robust flavors such as spice and coffee. And, of course, no rancher could turn down a Ramon Allones specially selected, a complex stogie noted with dried fruit and wood chips. No matter their taste, a cowpoke had plenty of options. While cigars are common iconography of cowboy existence, tobacco use during the heyday of the Old West was much more diverse than simple stogies and cheroots. Ranchers and wranglers favored their flavored pipes, filled to the brim with sweet and savory tobacco leaves, alongside hand-rolled tobacco cigarettes. The hand-rolled cigs specifically were a hot commodity. They were fast-tracked to the front of tobacco folklore by John Ruffin Green, an ex-Confederate soldier who founded the company that would later become Bull Durham Smoking Tobacco. On the western landscapes, cowboys opted for corn husks as their custom cigarette rolling paper. This idea wasn't new, however. Mexican and American native populations had been smoking tobacco out of shucked corn capsules for generations, and they, most likely, were the ones to inspire the cowpokes of the plain. Despite the proliferation of cigarettes, cowboys were careful never to be seen with one of the aforementioned machine-rolled varieties. These cigarettes, called pimp or sissy sticks, would earn you a one-way ticket out of Dodge and a lifetime of shame. No, a real cattleman stuck with their quirlies, the nickname for the hand-rolled cigs of frontier legend. For the cowboys who stayed away from cigarettes entirely, they'd be more likely to found enjoying a pinch or quid of chewing tobacco. The quid would sit in the side pocket of their mouths from sunrise to sunset, their grazing pastures fertilized with copious amounts of dipspit. Of course, cowpokes took their chew everywhere they went too, which meant you'd be hard-pressed to find a respectable establishment that didn't offer a spittoon. Spittoons, receptacles made from nearly any bucket or jar-like instrument, collected the various chews spat out by tobacco users. Banks, saloons, courthouses, and even the local post office would keep a spittoon by the bar top or back door for anyone in need. If it wasn't rolled in paper or lodged in cheeks, tobacco was frequently enjoyed packed in pipes. These specific types of tobacco products were called plugs, sold either individually or in bulk. Lone Jack, maybe the most popular brand of pipe tobacco, was produced in Lynchburg, Virginia, and exploded out west. This was most likely due to Lone Jack being the favorite of both Union and Confederate soldiers, both sides seeing a large chunk of veterans flock further into the frontier post-war. The last, but certainly not the least, form of Old West tobacco use was snuff. Snuff is tobacco grinded down into a fine particulate. This powder was often rubbed into the gums for quick absorption into the bloodstream. However, some curious cowboys inhaled snuff directly into the lungs for a similar, snappy onset of effects. Regardless of the mode of consumption, tobacco was accepted on the high plains and low valleys. And it had to be. Its economic significance, in a landscape lacking economic momentum, was critical if the Wild West wanted to develop into anything resembling American society. Thanks to tobacco tycoons like the aforementioned John Green or James Buck Duke, whose American Tobacco Company monopolized tobacco sales across the United States, tobacco brought stability to the frontier. As the zenith of the Old West reached its sunset, so did the influence of tobacco on American culture. Thanks to the medical advances of the Second Industrial Revolution, healthcare in the United States started peeling back the layers of drug use and its effects on human society. In 1888, for example, a man called Dr. Robert Koch found a real connection between chewing tobacco and tuberculosis, referred to as consumption in that era. Dr. Koch revolutionized infectious disease research and was one of the first whistleblowers to put a dent in tobacco's monolith. Then, in 1889, some of the most prestigious universities in the world published a controversial yet highly influential study on which demographics suffered more from tobacco smoke. They theorized manual laborers and those working hard, rugged jobs could smoke without consequence, whereas white-collar workers would experience a nervous breakdown if they smoked as much as a single cigarette per day. According to these Harvard researchers, sedentary lifestyles exacerbated the negative side effects of nicotine. Manual labor, on the other hand, fortified a man's tolerance. While these claims appear dubious with modern understanding, at the time, it was enough to punch big tobacco down another rung of their market share. A third blow to the tobacco hierarchy came right after the turn of the century, when Dr. Sarah Chase ensured women, who had only recently earned the social acceptance to smoke in public, were actually at a higher risk of disease. Right or wrong, these claims left a lasting imprint on attitudes towards smoking in 1905, attitudes that never wavered, only strengthening henceforth. As the following decades carried on, so did the medical awareness of tobacco's dangers. As the death numbers rose and the ability to freely market nicotine decreased, cigars and cigarettes became more of a novelty, a symbol of old-school living with a New World mindset. In many ways, the ideals of smoking tobacco were like the Old West itself. Its heyday was long over by the turn of the millennium, but memories of those who lived it still remembered its impact on popular culture at large. Tobacco, in all of its forms, wasn't just another drug or nicotine assembly line. It was a fixture of cowboy life and survival in the Western territories. Whether it be snuff or a stogie, a quid or a quirly, or a good old-fashioned pipe plug, tobacco ran the show and ultimately changed the legacy of the Old West and America forever.